I'm Daniel James, and you're listening to 7am. For most of Australia's recent history, preparing for war has meant preparing the military. Now the government is turning its attention on the rest of us. A new parliamentary inquiry will examine Australia's civilian preparedness and whether we could keep fuel flowing, supply chains moving, and essential services running through a major conflict. It comes as the government warns Australia is facing the most threatening strategic circumstances since the Second World War. Today, Director of the Lowy Institute's International Security Program, Sam Roggeveen, on what major conflict would actually mean for Australians and whether we're preparing for the right threats. It's Monday, August 17. Sam, for most of our lifetimes, preparing Australia for war has meant preparing the military. Now the government is talking about preparing the civilian population and the economy as well. So why is that happening now?
Well, we should start with the threat, actually, Daniel. So the reason this inquiry, I think, has even been launched is because Australians feel a lot more unease about international conditions than they have felt in the recent past. So you're quite right. We haven't really talked so much as a nation about mobilisation or about the civilian aspects of defence. And that's because we haven't had to, frankly. I mean, going back to the 1980s, for instance, the most plausible threat to Australia was if there was some minor incursion into one of our offshore territories or maybe to the north of Australia from Indonesia, or if there was some kind of civil strife in one of the Pacific Islands regions. And so we kind of built our military to deal with possibilities like that. Now, that world's changed, of course. China is not just as big an economy as the United States, but is building a really first-class military that is a genuine contender for becoming as good and as big, if not even bigger than that of the United States. And our political class understands that China is just going to be a much more influential part of our lives, much bigger and more influential. And so these slightly uncomfortable conversations have to take place about, what is it that we actually need to do, not just as a military, but as a nation.
So part of that is civilian preparedness. So what does civilian preparedness look like?
Well, I mean, one model is something like you see maybe in Finland or in Israel, where effectively it means you are, to a degree, militarising the entire society. So you have conscription, universal conscription.
On the Russian border, conscripts are trained for the wide gamut of roles in the army, including sniper or marksman.
I've never held a rifle in my life, so first time shooting was in the army. You start off with the basic assault rifle, and I found out in the army that
North Korea is another example of that, perhaps a slightly more invidious example, where when you take it to an extreme, it ends up, impoverishing really the entire society.
This year, Pyongyang said it was earmarking 16% of all state spending for defence. All men between the ages of 17 and 30 have to enlist in the military, and they have to serve anything from 3 to 12 years in uniform. The Korean People's Army, or KPA...
That's one end of the spectrum. I think for Australia, it will never reach those levels. I know there are some people who are calling for a reintroduction of conscription, but really in the short to medium term, probably what it looks like is a national capability to withstand a pressure campaign against Australia.
Right, so when officials say Australia needs to be ready for a major conflict, what kind of conflict are they actually imagining?
It's a great question, and of course nobody really knows. I think most experts would agree that the most likely contingency for Australia actually being attacked in a military sense, in a wartime scenario, would be if we're part of a wider war involving the United States and China. So the idea that China would ever attack Australia without that broader context is still pretty hard to believe. You really have to squint your eyes to imagine circumstances in which that would happen. That's not to say we shouldn't guard against it and prepare for it, because defence policy is a kind of insurance, insurance against extreme scenarios. I mean, we all insure our home, our property, and our lives and our health in that way against extreme scenarios. And defence policy is a way of doing that as well for the nation. Now, at a certain extreme, that becomes not just a defence effort, but a national effort. And the real fear that I think is driving this here is that Australia could somehow be cut off from the world, economically cut off from the world, and that would impede, first of all, our efforts to fight, but secondly, would be a major economic burden on Australians.
What would an adversary actually gain from trying to isolate Australia that way? And how difficult would it be to do?
Yeah, well, that's an excellent question, and it would be extremely difficult. So the effects I've described in that previous answer really relate to how a war between the US and China would affect not just us, but the entire world. There is a more specific fear that I think is driving the inquiry and other concerns in our defence commentariat, that China would have an interest in effectively isolating Australia in some sense to stop fuel supplies from getting to us, for instance, so that our forces and American forces that we are hosting couldn't conduct, say, air operations, that we couldn't defend ourselves from aerial threats, or we couldn't refuel our ships. I'm actually a bit sceptical about how easy it would be to isolate Australia in that sense. I mean, our geography helps us enormously in that regard, because there are so many different ways to approach Australia that isolating us would be extremely expensive and difficult proposition. And the Australian continent itself is so large, so that even if an opponent succeeded in isolating one or two ports, say Sydney and Melbourne, there's still Adelaide, there's still Perth, there's still Darwin, et cetera, et cetera. So our geography helps us a great deal and makes us very difficult to pressure in any sustained sense.
You've touched upon this, Sam, but would Australia be preparing for a war that comes to us, or a war that we decide to join?
Yeah, well, I mean, this is a really critical question in the context of the AUKUS agreement and the associated deals for the United States to have effectively a permanent military presence on Australian soil. So AUKUS is generally discussed as Australia buying submarines, buying nuclear-powered submarines, but certainly in the short term, and maybe even over the medium to long term, the more important element of it will be the fact that we're going to have a permanent American military presence on the West Coast with their nuclear-powered submarines, and sitting somewhat outside AUKUS, but nevertheless continuous with it, we're also going to have a permanent American military presence at an airbase in the north of Australia called RAAF Tyndall. And America's going to be able to conduct bomber missions, strategic bomber missions from that base. Now, to my mind, that makes Australia a huge target. If you're China, if you're involved in a war with the United States, you have a clear and direct incentive to strike those targets. So my concern has been that actually we are bringing the threat closer to us. We are making ourselves unnecessarily vulnerable. There are ways for Australia to protect itself, and there are ways for us to preserve our alliance with the United States that don't involve these kind of commitments, which actually make us more vulnerable.
Still to come, while conscription is still being floated by at least one former general. Sam, one of the people pushing hardest for Australia to take this seriously is former Home Affairs boss Mike Pezzullo, who has argued for a modern Australian war book. What would preparing the civilian population on that scale actually involve?
Well, I think when we think about civilian preparedness for war, there is perhaps a tendency to go back to World War II and even before that. So, the army really has and ground warfare really has an outsized place in Australia's historical imagination when it comes to military conflict. The Anzac legend is really centred around land campaigns and land warfare. But in the kind of future we're imagining, in which the United States and China might get involved in a war, and in which Australia needs to defend itself, that would be overwhelmingly an air and a maritime campaign. And so we shouldn't be thinking about civilian resilience as supporting a ground warfare over many years, like in World War II or even World War I. We should be thinking of much more rapid maritime war that is high technology, and importantly, that is not so much labour intensive, it is capital intensive. That is to say, it costs an awful lot of money, but there aren't quite as many lives at stake. So, ships and submarines and aircraft, of course, they take a lot of people to operate them efficiently, but it's not like the campaigns of those wars that really form the key part of our historical imagination. And so that changes also the way we think about civilian resilience and the civilian participation in the war. It really pushes us towards thinking more in terms of how good our national infrastructure is, how good we are at preserving our fuel supplies, the kind of stockpiles we have onshore in Australia that can allow us to continue to survive as a nation and to keep our economy moving and to continue to fight if we have to. So it's much less towards extended ground campaigns.
We've also heard from retired Major General Mick Ryan, who argues that Australia may no longer be able to rely entirely on a voluntary military. How seriously should we take this growing discussion about national service?
Well, I think partly the answer to that question is in the comments I just made about modern warfare, particularly for Australia, being capital intensive rather than labour intensive. It doesn't rely on a huge military in terms of the number of people, but it does rely on a very expensive suite of military capabilities. So conscription, to me, is not the right answer to that question. The people that we need are not going to be huge in number, but they are going to have to be highly trained and very, very well educated. So to me, it's more a question of investing more in the quality of the people that we recruit and that we train and that we educate, rather than increasing the sheer number for Australia.
So, Sam, if Australia is right to start preparing for war more seriously, what's the biggest thing we're currently getting wrong about our preparedness?
Well, for me, at the heart of this is AUKUS. So this is the biggest bet, the biggest national investment we've made in defence capability in a generation, and arguably the biggest bet we've made in the US alliance in the history of the alliance since ANZUS was signed in the early 1950s. So China now presents this huge challenge to the region and is on its way to becoming the dominant power. And what AUKUS assumes is that the Americans have a clear, vital national interest in stopping China from achieving those ambitions. I think the last 30 years of history suggests that's probably not true. So if you look at, for instance, the sheer number of military personnel that the US had in Asia 35 years ago and what it has today, it's roughly the same. So that alone, to me, is a signal that, their hearts may not be in it. And so if their hearts are not really in it, if they don't want to defend their position in Asia, then for Australia, the conclusion has to be, well, we have to do more for ourselves. And yet that's not the direction we're moving in. We're moving into doubling down on the alliance under AUKUS.
Sam, some of the more cynical amongst us might suggest that all this talk about whole-of-nation preparedness and civilian preparedness might be a way of raising the anxiety amongst the population to justify AUKUS. What would you say to that before we let you go?
Oh, I think that's unduly cynical. It's important for Australians to use the old Howard formula, alert but not alarmed. We live in a much more contested regional neighbourhood than we used to, for all the reasons I just talked about. China is going to become a much bigger power, a much more important power, and naturally, a country of China's scale is going to want to lead. It would be crazy, actually, to think that a country that is, if not the biggest economy in the world already, then certainly the second biggest, that it would indefinitely be content to remain a kind of subordinate, a strategic subordinate in its own region. No, that's not going to happen. It's going to want to lead, and that has repercussions for Australia. So even if we keep our heads down and keep quiet, that won't save us from trouble. So we're going to have the capabilities, not just military, but national capabilities to withstand the kind of pressure that we will inevitably come under from China in the future. And so I think there's something to be said for, alerting the public and educating the public to those kind of risks. I would also say that we need to inject a level of self-confidence here. To me, what AUKUS represents is a lack of self-confidence. It represents when risks arises, we run home to a great and powerful friend. But to me, that era is over. Australia needs to learn how to stand alone and stand confidently alone. But we only do that when we project and when we communicate national strength.
Sam, it's a fascinating conversation, and thank you for your contribution to it.
Thanks so much.
Also in the news, Prime Minister Anthony Albanese and New South Wales Premier Chris Minns have formally announced a gun buyback scheme they say is bigger than the Howard-era scheme in the wake of the Bondi terror attack. It's hoped other states will follow suit in the scheme, which is expected to take 274,000 guns off the streets. From November 2, gun owners in breach of possession limits can return their weapons for up to $1,000. And Erin Patterson's appeal against her life sentence for killing 3 relatives with a poisoned beef Wellington will be heard in a Victoria court this week. Patterson has always maintained her innocence. The prosecution is also appealing, arguing that she should never receive parole. I'm Daniel James. You've been listening to 7am. We'll be back tomorrow.